Welcome to the Heightened Rapport. Today we're just going to have a quick conversation, a little bit like an interview. I have Claus Dittmer here with me, and I am Yaku, and today we're going to talk about trauma. Alright, so I have a few questions for you, Claus. What qualifies you to discuss trauma?
So when I'm not with Heightened Rapport, I'm a trauma counselor. I work at hospitals, various hospitals in the region, where whenever a patient comes in a car accident or might be shot or something like that, they are taken to the hospital, and I will be there to welcome their family members when they come to visit. My work is to look after the family members, help them process the trauma they are going through, and help them support their family members while they are in the hospital. I work through various situations with them, and we try and focus on getting through the trauma and really trying to get past it.
Okay. Then I want to ask, can you give me a broad idea about what trauma actually is?
That is quite a difficult question, as trauma differs from person to person. We can't put our finger on it and say that this is what trauma is or this is traumatic. But if we look at how humans function and what human beings are, we like order in our lives. We stand up in the morning and we have our first cup of coffee, we have breakfast, and we have certain expectations throughout the day, what we expect and how we think things are going to go. But when something happens outside of this expectations, it sort of makes chaos.
Throws you for a loop.
Exactly. So we can't say that one person goes through this sort of situation, but it doesn't seem like it's traumatic for me, so it can't be trauma. When something creates chaos in that person's life, it's trauma. And it's really something as small as that. We get different degrees of trauma, and it can become a bit more intense for one person more than the other. But that just shows us that what may be trauma for one person is not trauma for the next person, because it might not make chaos in their lives. But in its essence, that's really all that trauma is chaos.
Okay. So you said that they call you in when you need to go in for trauma. How regularly do you have to go in? How regularly does a trauma case come to the hospital?
So we have days that nothing happens, which is obviously good for other people. Then we have days where easily I can be called out 10 to 12 times.
Wow.
Where I go to different hospitals with different cases. It's not only car accidents. We have a lot of different cases. And so it can happen up to 12 times a day.
Okay, so car accidents are obviously a big cause of trauma. It's an obvious cause. I think that's one of the things that we think of when we think trauma. What are the other big cases that you get, or the cases you get often that involves trauma?
So in South Africa especially, I think with violence, a lot of violence going on, gunshot is one of the major things we see. But also when we think about smaller things like getting hurt at work, when you have workers climbing up on a ladder and falling off. It's something that can cause trauma, a physical trauma we're speaking of, but also in a sense emotional, because you have to go back to work where you got hurt. Even if you look at people working in a mine, we have a lot of cases coming from the mines, people having accidents at mines, and various accidents at work is quite a thing that you can expect throughout the day.
So it can be something like something happens and now you're afraid of that situation, getting back into that. Like you get into a driving accident and you're afraid to get back in a car. Is it something along the lines of that?
Absolutely.
Especially with the mines, then they don't really want to go work in that situation again, and you need to get them through that.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Like I said, trauma is chaos, and before we can go back to a state which is sort of normal. And don't get me wrong, you can never go back. But when you need to go back to your normal setting, you still have to be able to go back in a state which you can function as you did before the accident happened.
So as far as I can understand it, you cannot go back to the way things were, but you can evolve and grow past that point.
Yes.
Would that be a fair assumption to make?
Yes.
And you help them grow past that point?
Yes, to try and help them get through it, get a possible way of looking at things, get a possible different way of dealing with things. If you think for a moment, someone that lost their leg, how can they go back?
Yeah,
they can never go back, but they can learn to walk with it, obviously with different specialities and different people helping them to know how to function better and help them with different aspects of their lives.
So I actually think that's an important point. You are part of a bigger group, a team. It doesn't just take this one person.
Yes.
It's, what will it be? The doctor, the
psychologist, the physiotherapist. There's a lot of specialities working, and my work is especially on the emotional part of it.
Okay, so I think you've already touched upon this a little. What happens to a person when they experience trauma? So can you just go a bit further? What actually happens to a person?
Yes. So the chaos that's caused by the trauma causes us to look at life differently, whether you want it or not. And that's what trauma is. It causes you to go out of your comfort zone and look at life differently. This is not something that we can change. It's not something that we can choose. We can't decide, okay, this thing has happened and I'm not going to let it influence me. That's exactly what trauma does. It influences every aspect of your life. And when we think about a physical trauma, that's not where it ends. You can't think that a physical trauma will only influence you physically. It influences you emotionally. It influences you spiritually as well. Just as an emotional trauma can influence you physically. You can physically become sick if you're not working through your emotions as you should be. And also affecting you spiritually as well. So to get to the point, I think there's a lot of things going on when trauma happens. And there's a whole diverse way it affects you, and different aspects of your life it affects you. And just working through one part of it won't really help you in the long run. It might help some symptoms, but it won't really help you to get through it.
So it's going to be a really long process. It's going to be a life change you have to make. It's not going to be a one-time fix and now you're done with it.
Yes. I think it would be wonderful if we had a sort of a formula.
Pull.
Yeah,
maybe.
Cure all, pull, or maybe just a formula. We can say, okay, let's follow these steps and the trauma will be over and done with.
I think that's really important because people think they need to do something specific. They need to do something, get over it and just move on. Not everybody thinks that, but I do think there are some people that think that's the way you have to go about it. And it is a process. It's something you're going to have to accept, learn to live with, and push through, become stronger. And I think really you need to get help. Something that's actually interesting for me is your academic background. So can you quickly just tell us what your academic background is?
It is quite interesting. I hope the viewers will find it interesting as well. I started out with a combination degree between psychology and theology. The degree was over 3 years, and I decided after that to focus more on the theology part of it. But in this degree, they helped us to understand a bit more about counseling and how to do counseling. Obviously with a combination from both theology and psychology. In my honors degree, it was a bit more about information and a bit more about doing research. Thereafter, I did my master's degree in, again, a combination between psychology and theology, especially on counseling again. So my studies overall went a bit more on the psychology and then a bit more on the theology. Again, a bit more on psychology and a bit more on theology. But overall, I tried in my master's to get the best combination between the two, because I think there's quite an obvious line between it, and yet there are some overlapping subjects and things like that.
So can you maybe discuss with us what can a person do to get through trauma?
Okay, so we have started to take a bit on that and to touch a bit on the subject. But when someone experiences trauma, they, like I said, they're going through a lot of things at that moment, and they aren't really thinking about themselves. They're thinking about everything going on around them. And the trauma is not just one moment, the moment that it's happening, that the traumatic incident is happening with them. It's everything that happens afterwards as well. So while it's happening, there's a lot of things going on, obviously. And already that is the process of getting through the trauma and getting through the next step. Because what happens next is the first part of the healing process and making sense out of the trauma. So the first thing to do about the trauma is to talk about what happened, to talk about the incident or the thing that you think caused the trauma. When we talk about it, we get a chance to get a bit of clarity around the trauma, to get a chance to think about certain aspects of it. Like I said, we as human beings we like order in our lives. When we get a chance to talk about the trauma, we get a chance to place that trauma somewhere in our life. And that helps us to see a clearer picture. So even if the trauma happened long ago, we might not have such a clear picture about it, but getting to talk about it, we're already starting to understand a bit more about what's going on. You can think for a moment when you put your hand in front of your face and you look at your hand. When it's right in front of you, you can see a lot of detail on it. You can see different parts of your hand. You can see different lines on the palm of your hand. When you start moving your hand further away, you start seeing other things. You start seeing, okay, this hand is attached to an arm, and so the detail of it becomes a bit more blurry when you move further away. But you get a chance to look at the broader picture of it. And I think talking about trauma and talking about the traumatic events in your past does exactly that. It gives you a better picture of the whole. And that's why it's important to talk about it. The next step, it's also important to talk about your feelings. And it's not just saying how you're feeling, how it makes you feel. It's more of getting to understand how the trauma is affecting you. It's easy to say that, okay, we need to see different parts of our lives. We see that something is affecting me badly and I need to change that. But if we don't know if something's affecting you badly, how are you going to change it? So talking about your feelings is acknowledging what the trauma is doing to you and has done to you in the past. So we can consider if some things might need change.
Okay, so for people considering out there if they should go to a counselor or maybe thinking maybe it's not needed, when do you think it should be the case that someone should maybe go get counseling, or is there some type of other help they can get? if they cannot get to a counselor?
I think these 2 steps are only the start of it all. It's perhaps the first 2 things that your natural instincts will let you strive towards and that you try and do to try and help you get through it. I also think that's why it's quite important to have people in your life that you trust and that can see how different aspects of life and things happening in life affect you, so that when it's affecting you in a bad manner, so they can have the freedom to talk to you and say, listen, Yaku, I think you should look after yourself, and I think perhaps some change is needed. And that's,
is this the intervention I was waiting for?
Absolutely.
No, is this happening right now in front of for you all to see?
Absolutely not.
It's my Pac-Man addiction, right? That's the problem.
Let's say so. Let's
go with that. All right. I actually want to ask you that. Can people go through this alone? Can they handle the situation alone, or do you feel they need to go out and see someone?
I think they can handle this alone. The first two steps of the intervention would be to talk to someone. So it's kind of hard, but I do think there are things outside of that you can do. And the whole thing about finding coping mechanisms. People find coping mechanisms in different things. We need coping mechanisms to deal with everyday life, not just traumatic things, but all of the other things as well. People find coping mechanisms in different things. Just think for a moment, the person that likes to write in a diary or likes to write books. On the other hand, the person that likes to read books, it's also a coping mechanism. Someone that likes to paint a picture. Someone that likes to exercise towards a certain goal. It's all things that, when you think about it, it's something that helps you to improve yourself. So thinking about coping mechanisms, it's something that you need to do to be able to move forward. When we go back to that picture of the hand in front of you, when we stay the same that we are, we see that trauma in front of us. And the trauma sort of stays the same because it's still there, I'm still the same, so we have the same picture of it. But when we work on ourselves and we improve certain aspects of our life, may it be a new skill that you learn, or like I said, working towards a certain goal, you improve on who you are, you improve on certain goals. And suddenly you are a step in another direction. When you look back at the trauma, you see, okay, this did happen, this terrible thing did happen, and I went through it the way I was at that moment. But the way I was at that moment is not the same I am now. I have changed. I have improved on certain things. Even if it may not be the things that you think needed improvement at that moment. It might be totally different things, like exercising. It helps you to look at things from another perspective and a bit farther away. And that's why it's important to work on yourself and to find things that you can improve on, and finding those coping mechanisms to help you challenge yourself in getting better and improving. And I think that's certainly a way of working on it. I think another way might also be to perhaps change perspective and outlook on things. I think it's something that sounds much easier than it is. But having a philosophical conversation with someone about pretty much anything can help you improve as well on your mindset.
Like the beginning of the universe and...
Exactly. I think you can go on for hours talking about that, obviously, as we have done in the past.
The problem is, before we started doing this today, we got sidetracked for an hour and a half talking about just that subject, but it does feel good. We actually both, I feel a bit better. And when we started doing this, it was just nice getting into things, just talking about something else, not worrying about stuff. I think something like that can be nice. And I like the idea that you said go maybe read a book. If you don't write or you don't draw or whatever, maybe go read something. That's maybe a form of escapism. You escape into another world, and that can help you cope maybe in your mind, make up stories. I don't know. What can you say about that maybe?
For one person, it might be reading a book that is a bit more academic focused. For another person, it might be a fantasy book that has nothing to do with anything. It just gives them a chance to escape that reality that's grinding on them all the time. And it's so important to sometimes just escape reality, because we get so caught up in our problems and trauma and things that keep us down all the time, that we need to look after ourselves in such a manner. And I like to think about all of this. This is the perspective I get from the philosophical view of it all. When we look at our lives on a timeline, say we are in the middle of this timeline, we can think for a moment that everything that happened before we are at the moment is things that happened in the past. We can't go back and we can't change it. We can try and do things differently, we are doing now, but we can never go back. Those things happened. We are here. Everything we did in the past brought us to this exact moment where we are right now. If we might have done something differently, we could have perhaps been in a totally different position. When we look at the timeline going forward, you see everything that lies ahead. How long is your timeline, Yaku, going forward?
I think maybe another, when we start transferring our brains to computers, I think maybe 150 years. How can you ask me that? I don't know.
That's quite a ridiculous thing to imagine. How am I halfway through my timeline? You can't.
I was actually thinking about that this morning. How do you know? And time kind of differs for people because, I don't know, a year for you might be 10% of your life. A year for me might be 5% of my life. And
we wouldn't know. This idea of the timeline helped me to think about the moment we are in right now. We can't go back and we can't change anything. And I'm not certain about tomorrow, neither am I certain about the next hour of my life, but I'm certain at where I am right now at the moment. And I've got control over where I am right now at this moment. Everything that happened in the past has made me who I am right now. And I can make a decision whether I want it to pull me down and influence me in a negative way, or I can learn from it and try and work on myself and keep improving on myself. This is a continuous process that we keep doing. Imagining where you are right now, learning from things in the past, learning from everything that happened in the past, helps us to see this moment with more clarity, and helps us to sometimes just take a step back in our life and see the whole picture.
So you say, okay, it's important to look at today and to work through the past. Sometimes the past can, especially traumatic experiences, can cast a shadow over your life. And that shadow might be so thick that it's difficult to see the present, see the good in that. How can you get past that? How can you see past that thick cloud?
I think it's a very important question you're asking. But I believe that we don't need to look away from the past. The past brought me where I am right now. We can embrace that past, because that past made me exactly who I am. And there's no point in moving that past away and say it didn't happen, or I don't want to make it part of my life. It is part of my life whether I want it or not. And I think that's the important thing that we need to remember, is that these things did happen to me. And it's terrible. Nothing can change the sadness about it. Nothing can change the terribleness about it. It's part of me, and it made me who I am. But what do I do with that? So not to look into the shadow of it all, but embrace what happens to you, embrace the trauma, and move forward from that, learn from it, make it your own, because it is your own whether you want that or not. And I think when we realize that these traumatic things that happen to us is part of our lives, and we can't move away from it. It doesn't need to pull us down. It can really be anything that helps us to see the whole picture. I think it's when we look at everything that we've just discussed, there's a lot of different aspects around talking about it and talking about your feelings, working with some of your coping mechanisms and things like that. But this is the most important part for me, is to make sure that you keep moving forward with whatever you have to move forward with. Because what you have right now to move forward with is not the same you had a year ago. And what a year from now you might have to move forward will not be the same you have right now. You have more things, broader perspective. You don't have less things suddenly to work with. You have more.
You have more tools to help you fix the
Yes.
problems, and yes, okay,
Yes.
I understand that.
Absolutely. And as we grow older, hopefully we can grow wiser as well and learn from these things. More traumatic things doesn't mean that we have more things to be morbid about. Rather, we have more opportunities to learn from, more things to move forward from, and more things that we can broaden our perspective and broaden our mindset about everything. And I really think that's a way that we can wisen ourselves and learn from these things, is to look at these things and embrace it, embrace the past, embrace what happened. It is yours whether you want it or not, but make it yours. Make it part of your story to move on.
Okay, so before we end this section, earlier you told me a story. It's probably a kind of parable about the 16-year-old. Can you maybe just repeat that now for the audience here?
So I had a conversation with one of my friends, and we spoke about trauma and what might be traumatic for one person, and that same thing being traumatic for another person. And I asked him the question, if a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old hypothetical lady breaks up with her boyfriend. That boyfriend was her whole world at that stage. Is that traumatic for her? And he thought, but she's 16-year-old. What does she know about love?
That's not what trauma is. Trauma is something.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
It's something serious that happens to
Yeah.
you. But for that 16-year-old, her boyfriend was her whole life. And they broke up, and she lost everything. She thought she lost everything.
At that stage, it does feel like that. It does feel like your world is ending. This person is gone. And then 4 or 5 years along the line, you kind of just harden. You start experiencing that less. And I think that's where you are when you're more grown up, more mature. You don't see things like that as trauma anymore because you don't feel it as trauma. But someone at that age, at that experience level, it's really a terrible thing. And so trauma can actually be a really wide range of things. And you probably have to approach it all differently because it's so different. Yeah.
And meet each person where they are at the moment in their lives. I know in my own life, each of us have different perspective on things. And even in my own life, sometimes I look back and I see, but how can I look at life this way? It's so strange. The way I look at it right now is the only and the right way. And that's exactly the way we think about things makes us experience things in that specific manner. Just as that girl that broke up with her boyfriend, she lost everything at that moment in her life. And it's just as the same for us if we lose loved ones in our lives. it feels like we're losing everything. And then we start working through these things. We start improving on ourselves and start working on other relationships as well. And we notice, but there are other things as well. Losing that person in the past doesn't take the sadness away. Neither does it dim what we felt at that moment. But these newer conversations we have with people and relationships we build on gives us perspective, because we know now more than we knew at that stage.
Right, I think we can end that there. You've given us a lot of information now. I feel more confident knowing what trauma actually is. You actually gave me a lot of information I didn't know before. And I hope it gave you clarity out there. And anything you would like to add?
If any of you have any questions, even on the broader subject, more than welcome to pop us a comment or even an email. I'd like to get that back to you as soon as possible, and I hope I can answer as good as I can.
Thank you. This was Claus. I'm Yaku. We are from the Heightened Rapport. May you have a lovely day further.